Hey everyone, welcome back to another Behind the Hype. So if you've joined us before, you'll know that we run Behind the Hype sessions here at Finastra at least once a month, if not most weeks. And the purpose of Behind the Hype is to take a particular overhyped topic in fintech, finance, technology, and break it down. But today I'm super excited to have a slightly different variation of Behind the Hype. So behind the glass ceiling. I won't dive into too much of what we're going to cover yet, because I'll leave that to my colleague Roxandra. But my name's Ryan. I work at Finastra. We're joined by amazing guests today. And what we want this to be is very much a kind of open discussion. So we have pretty much a panel format where we've got some questions that we're going to ask the panelists. We've also got some polls for you to take part in. So when it comes to a poll, we'll let you know how to take part. And if at any point you have questions or comments that you want to make, then please use the comments section and I'll be filtering through that and kind of bring it into the discussion, and that can feed some of the Q&A. So that's it from me. I'm going to pass over now to Roxandra.
Hello, everyone, and a pleasure to see you all virtually today, and a pleasure to host this with you, Brian. My name is Roxandra Aldea. I work with Finastra, and in my role, I help major banks in North America to frame and execute business cases for better banking through technology modernization. And I look at myself as a fintech enthusiast. I have been engaged in some of the more exciting bank digitization programs since the early 2000s, and I personally live in Vancouver, Canada. And I wanted to provide you with a quick overview of the session today. So in today's session, we are going to discuss leadership and gender diversity and inclusion. And these topics are certainly not new at all, but they have been brought to the forefront recently in a number of ways. And first of all, the COVID crisis has happened. And the most effective country leaders in controlling the pandemic by taking early and decisive actions were actually women. So countries like New Zealand, Finland, and Germany, as examples, did really well. So that's one data point that triggered us to think about this session. Second is there were a number of recent studies that you might have seen from well-respected educational institutions, the likes of Harvard and MIT. And they have published real evidence this year that women have a substantial number of effective leadership behaviors that make them great leaders, and that men can also lean in and adopt some of these effective behaviors, which are more dominantly in women, to be even more successful together as well-balanced team. And finally, the whole world was shaken by what we have seen, the recent events in the US that triggered the broader LGBTQ campaigns around the world by major corporations as well. And so while diversity and inclusion certainly means a lot more than gender, gender is an easier one to address because it really encompasses 50% of the population on either side. So that's the reason why we picked this as a topic for today, and we wanted to take a pulse check on that. So I have immense pleasure to welcome our three amazing leaders today, and I want them to share their stories with you. I hope that we can all learn one thing or two from today's session, and I hope that we can all shed some light on the glass ceiling up there. So with that, I'd like to ask our guests and leaders to introduce themselves. So I'd like to do around the table and start with Angeline, then Tom, and Wendy. Welcome to our episode today.
Thank you, Ruxandra. Hi, everyone. My name is Angeline, and I'm from Deloitte, Canada, and I'm based out of Toronto. I'm part of our Chief Strategy and Innovation Office here at Deloitte. And so basically my role is to design and develop internal systems to support the development and scale of technology-based solutions for our clients here at Deloitte. So you can think of me as a leader of a tech startup accelerator within a large organization. My professional background is in facilitation, solution design, technology sales, and strategic program design and development. really happy to be here.
Thank you, Angeline. Great to have you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Schickler. I am the COO of Zafin. We are a global leader in product and pricing control solutions for banks. And actually, prior to joining the fintech world, I spent almost my entire career in banking around the world, starting in New York, making my way to Dublin, ultimately spent quite a long time in Asia before settling back here in Vancouver, Canada. Very glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome.
And I'm Wendy Sherrock. I lead the operational effectiveness team, which is part of our chief customer office. We lead transformations across the organization, helping to remove barriers, make connections, to break down silos, not just ceilings, and ensure we drive positive experiences. I also have the pleasure of serving as co-executive sponsor of Finastra's Women at Finastra ERG, or Employee Resource Group, and I live in Lake Mary, Florida.
Thank you, Wendy. Great to have you with us. And what I'd like to do next is I'd like to start digging a little bit deeper into your backgrounds, and more as a way of allowing the audience to get to know you a little bit better as leaders in your domains. So what I'd like to invite you to do is if you can share a little bit more about what makes your leadership signatures unique. And feel free to share some of the leadership behaviors that you think make you the great leaders that you are. And can we start with Tom?
Sure, happy to start. Actually, before I get into a little bit about my leadership approach and style, I kind of want to start with a kind of moment of reckoning for me. Relatively early on in my career, I was very fortunate to have a boss, Nico, who pulled me aside and actually told me quite roughly that it's great to have great ideas. However, if you don't really have a meaningful connection with the people with whom you're working, there's going to be no ability for those people to really get access to and understand the importance of the ideas, buy in, and help to bring them to fruition. And, you know, for someone like myself who had really relied on do by example, set the example by what I do, and as someone who's actually quite naturally introverted, giving people access to who I am as a person wasn't necessarily the first and most natural thing. And so as I've kind of progressed my career and had a variety of leadership roles, in the first instance, building that connection with people, and especially my direct reports, is a really critical component. The other things, such as, providing clarity of vision as to where we're going, putting people in the best position to succeed based on what they're good at, removing obstacles that could possibly get in people's way, and most importantly, as a leader, empowering people. All those conditions are super important, but in the first instance, giving people access to who you are and having that connection is really critical.
Thank you, Tom. And I like the way you've expressed that and told the story. And what I'd like to do is before we move on to the other leaders, Ryan, can we ask a little poll here of the audience to just get some of their viewpoints? And specifically, I'd like to get the audience's viewpoints around vulnerabilities, because I know we all like and love to be great and perfect, but none of us are. And I'd like to get the feedback here from the audience. And we have the question here on the screen that we'd like to invite you to answer. And do we have the instructions, Ryan, for how the audience can answer the question?
Yeah, so there's going to be a couple ways. So you can answer via slido.com and use the code HYPE, HYPE. But if you are watching on mobile, say on LinkedIn Live or YouTube Live, you won't be able to escape to go to a browser. So you can post your response between the number either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 as a comment, and we will get the response on there. So 2 ways, either slido.com using that code there, HYPE, or you can post it in the comments as well.
Very good, very good. So how comfortable are you showing vulnerabilities at work? So that's an interesting question, and we're looking forward to seeing the poll results. So while the polls come in, I'd like to continue in our discovery of our leaders. So I'd like to invite Wendy next. So Wendy, could you share more about you and what makes you great as a leader?
Thank you, Ruxandra. I kind of see my own leadership signature, I think is the term. I'm very collaborative, so I really enjoy pulling teams together. And what I enjoy most is working with individuals to identify their strengths and kind of pull that into the team, so that we're pulling the team together to tap into the strengths, becoming stronger together. So with that, I tend to be very empathetic, which is a trait that has often been criticized in the leadership perspective, especially when you're a female. So that's something that I've definitely kind of experienced throughout my career. And I think the leader of New Zealand had a quote recently talking about that commentary as well, that she's often been told that she's not aggressive or assertive enough. But I stick by my empathetic nature. I think it's actually served me quite well, and so I stand by that. I'm also very, focused on pulling in and empowering the team. I know, Tom, that was a comment that you made, but I think it's also interesting to think about the strengths that we're tapping into in this COVID environment. And when you speak about vulnerabilities and willingness to admit that, I think we've all had to get a little more comfortable in this new world, because there's so many unknowns, there's so many variables that we're just not sure about. So transparency, I think, is very important in admitting that and saying, look, I don't have all the answers, but here's what I do know, and here's what we can focus on in the short term. Empathy is quite important, along with flexibility and adaptability, which, hey, I'm still working on that too.
That's great. And yes, sign me up for empathy, because I do think that that is becoming even more important in the times that we live in, where we all have to learn new things, how to work, how to shop, and how to live. So great perspective, Wendy. Thank you. And Angeline, what about you? Let's help the audience get to know you a little bit better as well. Sure.
So I've always led with humility, and I suppose it's not really a leadership style that I have. It's more of something that really has come natural for me in my career, in my everyday. And I wanted to share this quote. You may have heard it. It goes, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. And so from a work perspective, having this sort of leadership posture for me is key to thriving in the environments that I work in. And so earlier I mentioned I run an internal tech accelerator. So basically that means I get to work with super skilled, highly skilled folks that have a diverse set of backgrounds, and basically everyone is awesome. So how do I make them better? How do I create the systems to help their tech solutions scale? Well, for me, leading with humility means exercising a lot of active listening, continuously, exercising a growth mindset, being able to challenge the status quo, being actively curious, and with that, having the courage to ask questions, to ask those challenging questions from these, subject matter experts that I have to work with every day and collaborate with. But but most importantly, or in many instances, having the courage to ask them and my peers the obvious questions. And so going back to the economic situation that we're in right now, I think humility works leading with this, works in any situation. And in many ways, I'd argue it works even more so during uncertain times.
Very good. Thank you, Angeline. And what I loved about our panel here is the transparency and also the courage, because courage is a key leadership trait, the courage to also talk about your personal vulnerabilities as well. And that's the reason why we actually did the poll. So Ryan, can we share any results from the polls to see what the audience thinks here about displaying vulnerabilities?
Yes, so these are the responses from Slido. So you can see that most people fall in the bucket of 4. We've also had a lot of comments as well come in. Majority of them have been rating it kind of 4. There's a lot of 5s there as well. So it seems that our audience today, quite a lot of them feel comfortable sharing vulnerabilities in work, which I personally think is an amazing thing, that we have a high percentage of people who like to share it. And no one said 1, which is not very comfortable. So that's a good sign.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on that as a leader, and just thinking about, if you polled our teams, et cetera, and hopefully they would be in the 4 to 5 bucket. But it's really can be an environmental thing. And one of the things that always struck me, and I recall this really specifically at JP Morgan, where the leadership of Jamie Dimon made it really clear that we had to have the kind of environment in which people could say, I don't know, and raise questions, because the implications of getting something wrong based on a false assumption of knowledge could be quite significant and adverse, both to the bank and the communities which we were, empowered to serve, as well as obviously the regulators to whom we were ultimately accountable. So, we have to ask ourselves the question as leaders as to how we can kind of create that sense of safety for people to reveal vulnerability, and it could be in the form of what they don't know or otherwise.
So just picking up on some of the comments that have come through in the chat, there seems to be a lot around, I guess, benchmarking leaders, and also just understanding, how do you consider people for leadership positions? So, when looking at candidates, do you look at the number of years that they've had experience, or do you look at the merit? How do you assess leadership positions? Does anyone have any thoughts on that, or any experiences they want to share?
I can start. I think the behaviors are just so critical. Having some experience does help, but I think it's even more important to have those behaviors that you can tap into, the ones that we've been sharing already around empathy and building that team and the ability to empower others. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I start.
So when that question came in, it actually reminded me of what happened at another company I was at, which was a financial institution. And one of the things that they started to enforce from the head of talent was, when they're looking at shortlists for leadership positions, they want a 50-50 gender split. And they had certain times where people came and said, look, we don't have a 50-50 gender split. If you want that, we're going to have to lower the criteria. And he was very strict and said, no, like, we're keeping the same criteria, but I want you to go back out into the organization and really try and find those leaders who are more diverse. And what happened in quite a lot of scenarios is they were actually able to find them. And it was great because it wasn't that they didn't have to compromise in dropping that criteria. It's just they had to look harder. So I love that story because they then went on. There's a couple females that they found who didn't get that leadership position, but because they were then known, they got other opportunities later on down the line. So I want to pivot the conversation to talking about that glass ceiling. So to get started, I want to throw out another poll for the audience. So let me share my screen. So what can have the biggest impact on breaking the glass ceiling? Ways, again, that you can participate is you can either do it on Slido, or if you want to comment on the comment bar, then you can put A, B, C, D, E, or F. Don't worry about typing it all out. But to get started with our panelists, I always like to ask this question of, can you tell us a time or a moment where things went just really wrong, but you learned something from it? And this can be in relation to either when you hit that glass ceiling, how you overcame it, or it could be actually you overcome that glass ceiling and then something else went wrong. It doesn't stop after you've smashed through that. There's another one. So I'm going to open it up to either Angeline, Tom, or Wendy, whoever wants to go first, or Ruxandra. I think, do you want to go first, actually? Because I know you have some good stories.
Well, I can go first, just to break the ice here. And in the spirit of the conversation today, because we're talking about vulnerability, I will be vulnerable. So I will share one of my stories here about what went wrong in my experience in the past. And I was going through a career change. It was about 12 years ago. I was changing from a marketing into a sales leadership career direction. And that was at the time when my first child was born. And I decided to return from maternity leave after 3 months. And I went and started to look for a job in a sales management type of a role. And one of the first interviews that I went to, I really liked the company, I liked the job, but at the end I was told that I'm not hired, and they thought highly of me. They thought I had what it takes, but they were worried that I had a young baby at home and they were looking for a road warrior, and they didn't really think that I could meet all the travel requirements to do the job well with a young family. So eventually I did get an amazing job, and that was my entry in the fintech space, which I loved from day one, that I'm still passionate about today. And so I got the job I wanted with a global fintech organization at the time. And it's been very hard personally and business-wise, especially going through the first year. So, and I'll share with you personally what I was going through, because I wanted to do both jobs great. I wanted to be a great mom, and I wanted to be an amazing leader in my new job. So from a personal perspective, it's been hard, because wanting to be a good mom, I actually did want to breastfeed my baby throughout the first year. And luckily, together with my husband, who's an engineer by training, we figured out a whole supply chain for the breast milk, from starting all the way with a breast pump, freezing, storing, transporting, airplanes and airports. And it's been really hard, but I did it, and I've accomplished my personal mission. And business-wise too, it's been really hard because at work we were going through a merger or acquisition and product consolidation, and there were a number of clients who weren't happy. And so it was a very difficult year business-wise. So rolling it forward 1 year later, my territory and my team ended up being the top producer in our North American region revenue-wise. And when I look back at that year, I say that was the hardest thing I ever did. And it feels like everything that I was going to do from there on, it was going to be an easy road relative to that year. So that is my story about coming up against the glass ceiling at some point in time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story, Ruxandra, and putting yourself out there. I'll share too, and this was very early in my career. I just didn't see a path to a leadership role, and I don't know. I I don't know if it was the glass ceiling I was bumping up against, or if I put a barrier in my own way ahead of the glass ceiling. But I just couldn't relate to the kind of assertive behavior that I was seeing from other leaders. And I mentioned earlier that I had gotten feedback myself. And so I thought, well, maybe that's just not the path for me, and that's okay. So at the time, I kind of put myself in that box and far away from the ceiling. It wasn't until I had a role model, a leader who was female, who was a senior VP, and she really showed and demonstrated with her leadership style that being empathetic can actually be a strength. She was strong, she was effective, she drove accountability, but she did it in a very respectful way. And it was that moment that I actually started to at least take that barrier out in front of me and see that as a possibility for the future.
Do you know, that really just springs to mind just my thoughts around, I've always heard kind of, you're either too sensitive or you're assertive, and it's like I actually don't like the word sensitive, and I actually look at it at being emotional intelligent. But then some people think, oh no, you can't be assertive and emotionally intelligent at the same time. And I actually have met some people who are both those things. They are, very firm and fair, but equally, if something's wrong, they'll be able to pick up and actually have a word of you on the side, which for me is one of the best things, is when you can spot when something's not right in your team or someone's not having the best day, and you can talk to them offline.
Couldn't agree more.
Tom or Angeline, what are some of your stories about coming up against that glass ceiling, or have you seen anyone? Maybe Tom, what about, I think you're off mute actually, and you want to share a story?
Yeah, sure. I guess in terms of encountering the glass ceiling, if I think back to when I first took responsibility for the cash management business of HSBC in India, and I think the size of the organization was a few hundred people, and my direct report team was probably about 10 people, was entirely comprised of men. And even when I looked, one down beneath them, probably equally weighted, maybe there were a couple, but certainly not representative of the entire population of the broader team, as well as obviously the country. And so one of the things that I introduced, and probably in reflecting a bit on my communication style, I would probably tend to be the more direct approach, but I set out to suggest to the team that in the course of interviewing for prospective candidates, as we naturally had to replace people, that there would be a requirement that we would incorporate women into the recruitment, in absence of which they couldn't proceed to hire. And I actually met a fair degree of resistance because people suggested that might not be fair. How could we do this, right? Like, you can't, whoever's going to apply is going to apply. We need to take the best candidate, et cetera. I think we've all heard these things. And with the support of HR, managed to kind of enforce that policy. And actually over time, by the time I left, I would say we were approaching the appropriate level of diversity from a gender perspective within the team. And so, sometimes we can't just let the natural course of events continue to unfold, because within those environments, the biases which will have put things in the place that they are going to continue and persist. And so we need to introduce ways. And that's certainly one thing and one way that I've observed that can help. And, even now, when I look at our solution engineering team at Zafin, I'm really pleased with the fact that whereas I don't think we've ever had any women engineers prior to the past year, we're about to hire our second woman engineer, and that's pretty exciting. So, it is possible through introduction and requirement of change to introduce that without compromising anything with respect of the quality of the output and the creativity of the team.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to build on that. Thank you for sharing that story. So I think, if we're having a conversation about the glass ceiling, we're having a conversation about inclusivity in our workplace. And so being an inclusive organization inherently starts with the recruitment process, to Tom's point. And so I have a few thoughts on this. And I think we really need to be aware of our natural tendency to gravitate towards people who are like us. I know I've been guilty of this, and I need to check that bias. So, to Tom's point, at your previous organization, you looked around, all the engineers hired male engineers. So when we recognize this tendency, we need to realize that, the tendency to hire folks that look like us, who likely went to the same school, have a similar sounding name. This just ultimately leads to a homogeneous workplace. So what I'd like to offer is, instead of focusing on that, is for us to think about when the personality traits and core values of the folks that we have the potential to hire. And with that, recognizing potential over performance. So, and what I mean by potential over performance is many times, what I mean by that, is that we need to recognize that oftentimes women from marginalized communities or face additional challenges outside of their work. And so these challenges are also, quite frankly, different from the challenges that their male counterparts encounter. So in many ways, when you look at a woman or a person from a marginalized community's background, or when you look at them holistically like this, and you recognize those extra challenges that they may have faced, in many ways you can see this as a reflection of their resilience and their tenacity and their grit that has helped them get to that table where they're interviewing with you. And so just thinking or considering these challenges that particularly women face during this pandemic, right now, women take the brunt of childcare and take the brunt of homeschooling in their day jobs. So they often have to do that on top of their day jobs. So again, when we look at a person holistically and we see their potential and we vector more towards their potential versus their past performance, I think we can build a more inclusive workspace.
Loads of things. Oh, sorry, Wendy, you go first.
I was just going to comment that, Angeline, you bring up a great point, and it's the intersectionality. So a lot of women that are, we might have that glass ceiling. It's important to note that when you have that intersectionality, that glass suddenly gets a lot thicker. So if you're a woman of color, if you're a woman that's part of the LGBTQ plus community, or both, it just gets that much harder and harder to crack the glass. And to Angeline's point, there's external factors that also weigh into that. And it's one of the priorities that we're focusing on at Finastra, to really hone in on intersectionality as it relates to women at Finastra. and to look at the data too. So there was a lot of comments around, you know, recruiting and looking at kind of all levels. You know, it's kind of a key focus area for us in the following year and in this year rather to hone in on that. But it is important to look at holistically the individual. At the end of the day, it's about the individual, right, and understanding the potential, as Angeline has said. But intersectionality is an important concept that I think we all need to be aware of and focused on.
I was just going to say loads of things have been going through my mind. Just wanted to pick up on a couple points. So I love, Angeline, your comment on potential, because if you think about building a kind of a good talent pipeline with that succession, if you just had, and I've been in this situation where they've hired an entire team which are all kind of high performers, experts, etc. There was no sort of building blocks. There's no people who were, you know, had the potential. They were all there. The succession planning sort of fell apart because they all sort of left at the same time. Where actually, if you hire for potential, you can get others who will stay a bit longer because they'll be mentored by some of the people who are more experts. Tom, did you want to jump in and say something?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, just linking something you were talking about earlier, Ryan, with respect to vulnerability, and then picking up from what Angeline was talking about in two ways. One, the propensity to choose people who are kind of like ourselves, yet at the same time, also contemplating the performance versus potential. And so one of the things that I have read about and I've been contemplating is the fact that when we hire, when the hiring process typically takes place, broadly, men tend to be selected based on their potential and women based on performance. Like this is based on whatever studies, et cetera. And women have historically been judged very much on performance. And so when you take some of the mitigating factors in terms of what could have impacted performance, such as, you know, raising children, et cetera, it kind of reinforced the outcomes which we've observed, which is like a propensity for leaders in companies to be men. And so when when we think about how to address these biases, we need to recognize that. And so, Ryan, you were earlier talking about, well, what do you look for in when you're hiring a leader? Being conscious about these things becomes really important. And, you know, something even as we've contemplated, like, you know, over the past few months, obviously observing what's going on in the US and having to ask ourselves the question around how we look at the world, understanding what might be unconscious bias is really critical for us as leaders. And, you know, potential versus performance is just one area in which that's been reinforced.
I just want to show the poll results, actually, because it's interesting to have a look at what the audience think is going to be what can make the biggest impact. So let me share them now. So quite a spread, actually. So mentoring was one of the big ones, which I'm actually quite surprised about. There's calling out bias is the second one there. We've had a few comments, and I'd like to, I guess, pivot the conversation and hand it over to Ruxandra to lead more on, you know, what do we do to actually break that glass ceiling? Like, we've spoken about the glass ceiling, it's there. How do we actually, what do we do? And there was a specific comment from the audience that they would love to find out more about coaching. So over to you, Ruxandra.
Yeah, so the poll results are very interesting, and because it seems that mentoring and sponsorship and calling out bias, which we have talked about and Tom has covered that really well, I'd like to focus for a second on getting some perspective here around mentoring and sponsorship. And where I'm going with that is, what if we look at the role of male allies in helping change the gender balance? And I'm looking at it from the two perspectives. here in terms of and examples of if the guests here can share stories of male allies who believed in you and helped you progress. And I'm thinking for our female leaders on the panel. And Tom, if you have stories or examples of a female who you helped in her career progression or leadership progression, and here it could be any example. It could be examples from work, examples from family and friends. But I'm really curious to see the role of that male allies, whether it's sponsors, mentors, supporters, could help in advancing and changing the gender balance.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I think too, it's interesting to see that mentoring is the number one, and it's another area that we're focusing on at Finastra as well. But there is a distinct difference between mentorship and sponsorship, and just in case that anyone's not clear on the difference, because I hear that a lot, that question a lot. Mentoring is building that kind of personal relationship with two individuals where you're focusing on objective, something that individual is trying to improve upon. Whereas a sponsor sponsorship is all about what that individual says about you when you're not in the room, and they advocate for you for a program, a project, a position. I've been very lucky to have a lot of male managers, bosses support me over my career, and sometimes I've gotten in my own way. I had a boss that reached out to me, a previous boss that reached out with a quite significant step up in role and responsibility. I think it was like a couple levels up, and I kind of doubted myself more than my previous boss did, which is kind of silly for me to say out loud now. And then later in my career, I had a similar situation, but by then I'd learned a little bit about the term imposter syndrome and the statistics around, men being comfortable to apply for a position when they have 60% of the criteria versus women at 100%. And this time when a male ally reached out with an opportunity, I didn't hesitate. And I will call out that my husband has played a strong role throughout my career too, and being one of my biggest cheerleaders to just kind of reminding me that, yeah, you can do this, it's okay. And now I start to try to recognize that pattern in others to try to help. I've had several women kind of share with me that they felt they weren't ready for a role that somebody had approached them on. And I immediately went into, well, let's break this down and let's talk about all the strengths that you bring to the table. And again, I'm going to go back to Angeline's word, potential, all the potential you have in this role. And I'm happy to say that they've said that that's helped make a difference. So I just wish I could go back in time to my younger self, but lucky to have a lot of strong male allies throughout my career.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. And Angeline, what about you?
Well, I'll add to that in that, interestingly, in my 15-year career so far, I've probably spent less than 2 years under direct management from a woman. So, and I've worked in many large organizations, and the majority of my time has been working in a male-dominated team. I have a technology background and with male leadership, and I have to say that I've been very privileged to have great male sponsors along the way the entire time, and key female sponsors, but the majority being male just because of the reality of my environment. And I guess I have to credit the leaders that made the time for me to be that sponsor and to really understand and get to know my strengths and help me identify how to build on those strengths. Those were the most important relationships that I've had in my career so far. And I guess those same sort of traits that, Wendy mentioned were from not only the male sponsors that I had, but the female sponsors as well. So I think it goes beyond, male, female. I think it's more, as leaders now, when I reflect on who I sponsor, I try to look for, again, looking for those high potential folks, looking for the folks that perhaps didn't have the same opportunities that I had, the same sort of networks that I had, and try to nurture them. So that's been my experience.
Thank you for that, Angeline.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a couple of aspects of this. I think one way I've been super fortunate in both senior leadership positions at HSBC as well as at JP Morgan. My bosses were women, two of the most accomplished women in banking over the last few decades. And so have had access to and had the opportunity to learn from these women who've accomplished incredible things, and in many ways inspired me and helped unlock aspects of myself, which probably I would not have had access to. And that in turn probably imbued upon myself a sense of responsibility to look out and find and encourage, mentor, and sponsor the next round of leadership, and many of the women. And so thinking back even to the example I talked about earlier, where in India, actually one of those people who's a very close friend of mine and somebody that I don't spend enough time with, but we still connect regularly. And she's made it to be one of the most senior people in financial services in India, leading a nonprofit organization that provides access to banking services to the unbanked in a very effective way. And so, when I think back of the accomplishments and even any contribution that I would have made, it's those types of things which become really important. And so there are so many ways that we can make a contribution, and we need to kind of look broadly to find them.
So I just want to pull up, we've got one more poll and I've got a couple questions to go through. So let me just put up the next poll so the audience can do that in the background. So what are underrepresented groups falling short of as leaders? So you got your options there of confidence, courage, assertiveness, network, balance between work and life. And last option, they don't fall short at all. A lot can be learned from them. So I'll let the audience members take part in that. And I want to ask now a question on generational inclusion, because we're at a point now where we've actually got, in some cases, at least three generations in most organizations. So Gen Z, Gen Y, which are millennials, and Gen X, which I believe are called baby boomers, if I've got all those terms right. Thoughts on that? Who has a thought on actually how do you gel different teams together where they are from different generations? And also, I've heard a lot about, Generation Z like this. Like, do you believe in the terms where you just kind of bucket and say in general, Gen Z like companies which have a purpose?
I can start with that, Ryan, and I can start it from the perspective of Gen Z, because you mentioned it as a new cohort that's just starting to hit the workforce. And interestingly enough, Generation Z is actually the largest cohort in the world's population. It's about a third of the world's population. So it's hardly hard to ignore. And as organizations and leaders, we do need to be prepared to understand this new generation. And the reason why that's near and dear to my heart, is I have 2 children within this generation. They are further behind. They are probably still a decade away from hitting their work years. But nevertheless, it's something that I'm keeping on top of to understand. And my concept about how do you blend in generations, it's all about leaning in. We've talked here about empathy. We have to lean in and understand each other. We have to understand the new generation, whether there are things that we like or don't like about them. And I used to complain a lot about my own children, about they play too many video games. They spend too much time on Fortnite. And I don't like that. It shouldn't be like that. And I used to study more rather than play. And I realized to train myself that that's not a productive way to think about it. And I started to actually do some more in-depth observation, researching that generation with that purpose of leaning in. It's very important to understand where they come from and why, and at the same time, allow them to lean into our generations, understand, be open and transparent with them as to where we're coming from to create that common basis of understanding. I also think in terms of what's important to them, which goes back to the concept of lean in, the new generation hitting the workforce, and I think it's more of a continuation from the millennial trend as well, but it's very prevalent in Gen Z, is the concept of sustainable company and workplaces, and definitely diversity and inclusion is one of those components. And in some of the research that I was doing, I was actually sitting down with a Gen Z female who's 22-year-old out of Europe. And it's one comment that she made. She's an amazing young leader going to university there. And one amazing comment that is still fresh in my mind, she said, I will never join a company, no matter how great the pay is, unless the company has a great sustainability program, corporate social responsibility, diversity and inclusion. And that's very important. It's a continuing trend, and I think it's going to amplify. And that's the purpose of our discussion today as well, to understand how some of the culture needs to blend in order to make room for the new generation hitting the workforce.
Yeah, well said. And I think we have something to learn from all the various generations. I can remember when about a year back, we had an intern that fell into the Generation Z, and I understand that broadly speaking, that Generation Z is really looking for that stability. They want relationships with their managers, and then I kind of say that out loud and think we probably all want some of those aspects. But maintaining that open dialogue is really important. And I will admit that, first kind of getting to know this individual, it took a little bit more time, but it is, for me, it always comes back to that individual. And what I think is really great about diversity across all the spectrums, including age, is that those individuals bring their own unique perspective, and they have some really creative, innovative ideas. So to me, it kind of feeds back to the importance of having a diverse group, whether we're talking about gender, age, or any of the other areas that we're speaking about. We have a lot to learn from each other.
Just to kind of butt in there, I laughed a little bit when you said about they want a relationship with the manager and all of that, because reflecting on it, I have a habit of inviting myself around for dinner and being like, my very first manager, I actually messaged him the other day going like, by the way, I'm coming around to see the dog next week. Like, it wasn't a question, it was like, what day works with you? Anyway, enough about me. Angeline or Tom? Who wants to go next? Angeline.
I'll just quickly comment. Being in a position to manage and hire these younger generation, as Ruxandra said, they tend to demand more, understand more, understand how their contribution impacts the whole system. When I started off at that age, I just, to be fully transparent, just did what I was told. and tried to do it really, really well. Whereas now, I think it's more challenging to manage younger folks because of that curiosity, because of the demand to understand how they connect with everything else. And quite frankly, I find it refreshing, and I find the challenge exciting, and I think we can learn from them. I mean, I think it doesn't have to start with, a 20-something-year-old saying, I will only work for an organization that has a D&I program that is serious about their commitment to sustainability, that is serious about equity within the workplace. I think we should all demand that, period, that this is, something that we should all be quite vocal about that. And if it's the young generation pushing for that, then, let's learn from them, and let's pick up on that energy and make that change.
Beautifully summarized, Angeline.
Yeah, very much so. I was trying to think. I was trying to contemplate this question, and broadly for the last week or two. And, in one sense, I can say, well, I've been fortunate enough to work in a series of regional global roles where by virtue of that, you're coming in contact on a very regular basis with such a diverse amount of cultures and different types of expectations, different working styles, et cetera. And that's really been of great benefit in terms of orienting towards a variety of different people and on a regular basis. That said, I don't think that necessarily fully prepares for some of these generational understandings, and certainly being a parent can be quite revelatory in this respect. I think one thing that strikes me about the opportunity that we have, especially with the people who are coming into the workforce now, is there's such because the generations who are entering the workforce now, or the generation that is, have had access to such a wide amount of information at their fingertips. Their demands for transparency are so much greater. And that in turn asks a lot of us as leaders. And the expectations of us are much higher. If anything, I think these are positive things. I mean, we talked about a lot about empathy, et cetera, and obviously building a connection with each. And Ryan, you're what you would describe, and you're kind of joking, as a little bit of intrusion, I think is actually quite natural. And I think it makes a lot of sense. But the stakes are higher for all of us, because at any given time, let's face it, the people now are so much more aware. And so that puts a bigger responsibility on us as leaders. But ultimately, I think, that transparency creates accountability, and you can't have responsibility without accountability. So I think it's all a good thing.
Something that comes to mind is I really like thinking, if you for early talent being empowered to do stuff, but equally leaders being proactive as well. And a personal example I've had is reverse mentoring. And I've had it both ways, where when I was junior talent, I actually approached a senior leader and said, you know what, I think you'd be really open to actually hearing from a different generation's point of view. And I approached them and said, will you let me reverse mentor you? I think you need a mentor. And they said, yeah. And it was a great relationship. And about a year afterwards, I had it the other way, where I was lucky enough to be on a panel internally at work. And then I got a phone call the next day, and it was a managing director who said, I heard you speak, and I want to approach you to be my reverse mentor. And what was great about that is I got really excited, because I'm like, oh my God, there's this managing director calling me up saying, will you reverse mentor me? But she was very clear, and she said, I want to do 3 sessions, and this is why I want to do it. I'm moving into a new role. I want to get to understand the team, and the team is very diverse in terms of generations. And I just loved that there was proactiveness in both senses. It can come from the top down and also bottom up. I'm very quickly, so I'm conscious of time, just show the last results of the last poll. So where underrepresented groups are falling short, most popular votes were confidence, network, and last one, they don't fall short at all. I guess closing comments from everyone, which can be related to the results of this poll or just in total this session. Who wants to kick off? I'm gonna pick Wendy to kick off with her closing thoughts. You always have great thoughts.
I'll kind of give you my answer, which is we have a lot to learn from each other. So I think that's I'll just kind of start with that, and I'll say what I said earlier. It is, at the end of the day, it's understanding our unconscious biases, and although we talk about all these groups, I think the most important thing is that when we're interacting with somebody, we really understand them as an individual, not as male, not as female, not as any of these other labels that we're talking about, and understand what sparks their passion so that you can help them chart their path from a career path perspective.
I think I'll just quickly add on to Wendy and tie it to the results of the last poll. I think that collectively, this panel and the folks that have joined us have all seen an opportunity for mentorship, and mentorship being key to breaking the glass ceiling. And so I think as leaders on this call, on the panel, we need to recognize the privilege that we have and look around and see the people around us and look for folks that, again, have the potential where we can make the most impact to mentor them and to sponsor them and to help them with the areas that we saw as lacking on the previous poll. Perhaps that can be on the last poll, sorry. Perhaps that can be a start of what we can do next.
Yeah, I was looking at those and looking at the choices. There are so many things that have to be done, and it's key to avoid the false duality and make an unnecessary choice. Yet clearly we need to prioritize. But so many of these things are important, and what's at stake is so critical that we each need to find within ourselves the way that we can do the best to advance this and make the choice, because it's so critical and important, and we need to set up the world for the generations to follow us. And this pandemic situation in the US right now especially are reminders of the importance that each one of us have in making the change that we want to see. So I know I've really greatly appreciated the opportunity to spend time with leaders like Wendy and Angeline and Ruxandra and you, Ryan, and I've learned a lot through the session. So I really want to thank you for the opportunity.
And I would like to thank all of you for the opportunity today. It's been a pleasure to be sitting with you all here and our audience here virtually. And of course, I'd like to thank Finastra for giving us the opportunity for such a great platform to talk about and remind ourselves about these kinds of issues. So I feel honored, privileged, and very thankful for having been here with all of you today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all at the next Behind the Hype, or whatever it may be named. Maybe we'll cross out hype and we'll do another one like this.
Thanks.